Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
My name is Sharon Peterson, and our scripture this morning is from the Old Testament, 1 Kings 17, verses 7 through 16. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. May the Lord bless the reading and the hearing of his word.
Elijah bursts on the scene. Like, in contrast to all the other stories and heroes we've looked at in the past few weeks, with Elijah, we don't get any backstory. We don't know what his childhood was like. We don't even know how he experienced a call into ministry. He just appears, bam, with a prophetic announcement. And then 10 chapters later, less than that actually, he is whisked away on a chariot of fire. But yet in those brief chapters, in that brief moment in history, he makes an indelible mark on Israel's story. So that, 700 years later, in the time of Jesus, Elijah and Moses would be both held up as the twin pillars of the Israelite faith, one representing the law, the other representing prophets. It's such that, Jesus, when the disciples witnessed him on the Mount of Transfiguration talking to two men from heaven, who is he talking to? Moses and Elijah. That's how important Elijah would become. But like I said, he appears without any fanfare or notice. What made his story so important, I think, was that it came at a time of great crisis and conflict. He was literally battling for the soul of Israel. That's what was at stake. Because the people were moving astray. If you go back to chapter 16 in 1 Kings, you get the setting. There's a king named Ahab, son of Omri, and according to the Bible, he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those who were before him. What did he do? He married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidonians. Now, pause there, because likely Ahab didn't marry Jezebel for love. He probably married Jezebel as a way of making an alliance with the Sidonians, as a way of making a treaty. That's how treaties were sealed, was with the marriage. And not only did he marry the daughter, But he agreed to bring in their gods, their worship. And so to please Jezebel, to please the Sidonians, he built an altar, a temple to the god Baal right there in the capital city of Samaria. Now, who is Baal? You see him throughout all the Old Testament, but who exactly was Baal? Well, in the Ugaritic culture that surrounded the Israelites, he was the god of storm, which, I always think of like Thor, from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the god of storm. But that's not the way they thought of it, because you got to think in an agricultural society, rain meant life. So the bringer of rain was also the bringer of life. Look at these two texts that you can find from ancient poetry that kind of speak about Baal. One, let the heavens rain oil, the wadis run with oil. Then I will know that the mightiest Baal lives, the prince, the Lord of the earth is alive. Or flip it around, in 7 years, Baal is absent. 8, the rider of clouds, no dew, no downpour, no swirling of the deeps, no welcome voice of Baal. You see, the people there lived and died by whether or not they had the right amount of rain for their crops. And if you were dependent on the right amount of rain, then pleasing the God of the rain and worshiping him became like this high priority. And so Elijah comes along and says, don't be fooled, people of Israel. Don't follow after this false god. Baal is not the one who brings the rain. Instead, he proclaims, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, as our God is the true God, I declare to you, neither dew nor rain will fall for the next few years, except at my word. You think Baal brings the rain? You think Baal brings the dew? I'll show you who has the power. Yahweh will shut Baal up. That's his announcement. And sure enough, there's no rain, no dew, and the people suffer because with the drought comes famine. And Elijah suffers on along with them, perhaps even more so, because he was the messenger of God. And we all know the old adage, we kill the messenger, right? And so Elijah was not safe in the country of Israel. Instead, God sent him eastward to a region, the Brook of Kerit. It was close to where he lived. He was a Tishbite, so the Brook of Kerit was close to Tishba. But there in the wilderness, hiding out from everyone, he finds a ravine through which flows a little brook. And this is just enough water for him to live on. And every day, the Bible says, ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening. And this is curious because ravens were considered to be unclean creatures. Like they were carrion feeders. They ate dead stuff. They were not, what you're supposed to live on, but that's how God provided for Elijah, which you could think of one of two ways. Either you could say, well, God provides in the most unexpected ways, or you could say when you're hungry, you're desperate. Beggars can't be choosers. He would take the food however it came to him. But that's how Elijah lived. And we don't know how long he lived there in the Brook of Kerit, but for some period of time, that was how he survived. Until one day, we read this verse, then after a while, the brook dried up because there'd been no rain. I just want you to pause for a moment and reflect on those words. After a while, the brook dried up. Have you ever been in a place where your brook dried up? That there's some place from which you drew life, some source. It might have been a relationship that you drew life from. It might have been a job or position that you held or a reputation. It doesn't always have to be unhealthy. It could have been something really good, but you drew life from it. But it by nature is temporary. All things are temporary except for God himself. And sooner or later, all those things that we draw life from other than God eventually dry up. Have you ever been in that place? You know, like you think about Elijah. Elijah would never have moved from where he was if the brook had not dried up. Even though God had much more to his story, even though God had great things planned for him, he would have never left that brook as long as there continued to be water coming from it. I had a supervisor, mentor, when I was a chaplain in a hospital, and she always said to me, she said, Dave, people keep doing what works for them until it stops working. Only when it stops working are they willing to change. Only when the brook was dried up do we begin to seek out some other source of life. If you've ever been in that place, then you know exactly how Elijah was feeling. Because he was confronting the question, that universal question of, what next, God? Where are you taking me from here? And God answers him. He says, okay, I want you to go to Zarephath, which is in the region of Sidon. Now, if you don't know where Zarephath is, that's okay. I didn't until this week. I had to look it up myself. Zarephath was not the next town down the road. It wasn't like a 5-mile walk from the Brook of Kerit. It was all the way north of Israel in the region of Sidon. So this was a long journey of faith and trust. And it was in Sidon, which is the exact place where Jezebel was from. In other words, God sends Elijah to Baal country, to enemy territory, and says, that's where I want you to go, because that's where I'm going to provide for you. And when you get there, I want you to open your eyes and be on the lookout for a widow. Not a rich, prince who's going to take care of you. A widow. Again, God provides in the most unexpected of places, because widows did not have wealth and property. In that day and age, widows were objects of charity. They couldn't own property. They couldn't make income. They depended on others for their care and their well-being. And that's whom God sends Elijah to. A widow who has next to nothing, and who, above all other things, is an outsider, a Baal worshiper. We know this because when Elijah asked her, will you share with me a little bit of bread? Notice how the woman replies. She says, as the Lord your God lives, which is very similar to how Elijah began, as the Lord our God lives. But she doesn't say our God. She says, as the Lord your God lives. She doesn't follow Yahweh. But in order to, for Elijah to understand, I'm telling you, she swears by Yahweh. She says, I swear by your God, I got nothing to give you. Just a little bit of flour, a little bit of oil. Like just now, I'm gathering sticks to make a fire so I can prepare my last meal for my son and I. And then after that, we're done. We got nothing. We're ready to die. And Elijah says, well, I'll tell you what. I make you a promise. Don't be afraid. If you share with me a little bit of the bread you're making, I promise you, my God will not let you run out. There will always be flour in your jar. There will always be oil in your jug as long as you share it with me. And I don't know what made this woman trust Elijah. I mean, honestly, you have to picture what Elijah had to have looked like. He's been living in the wilderness by a brook, being fed by the birds. I mean, and he's made this long journey to Zarephath. He had to be a sight. But maybe this woman was desperate. Maybe she had faith. Maybe she just had compassion. But whatever reason it was, she says, okay, I'll share with you our bread. And then lo and behold, the next day, there's a little more flour and a little more oil. She shares her bread again, and the next day, a little more flour, a little more oil. And so it continues day after day after day. At no point in this experience does the Bible say that her jar filled to overflowing or that her jug overflowed with oil. It was just enough every day for them to get by. It's like the manna in the wilderness. God was teaching them, showing them, if you depend on me and trust in me, I will provide what you need. And so she did. She gave and shared, and somehow God multiplied that. Again, I pause and ask, have you ever been where this widow has been? Have you ever been at a point where you just thought, I am at the end of my rope? I have a little bit left, but certainly not enough to give, not enough to share with anyone else. And I'm not even talking about financial resources, although sometimes you can be at the end of your financial rope, and that is scary. For me, that's happened more often not around finances, but it's around energy and time and emotional well. Have you ever been at the bottom of your well emotionally, where you just got, or the bottom of your well spiritually, faith-wise, where you just don't have anything to offer anymore? Have you ever been in that place? You know how that widow felt. And yet somehow she was able to take what little she had and to offer it. And the amazing thing is, in the offering, it was multiplied. The only time Jamelin and I have lived among people who kind of speak to the reality of this story is when we moved down to Haiti right after we were married. Jamelin and I lived in Haiti for 2 years, and I know this picture. This is a picture of a market woman in Fanwa, and it looks like abundance, like all kinds of fruits and vegetables there. And when things, the weather was good, when times were good, there was abundance. But they lived hand to mouth, and they were very dependent on the rain. And I remember what it was like whenever droughts came. There was no food. Or after a hurricane would come along and destroy all of their crops, it wasn't like they had crop insurance like our farmers do. Like literally, they would just tighten their belts and survive. They were masters of survival, and they were masters of faith. Jamelin and I went down there thinking we were going to go help, right? But as soon as we were down there, we realized, much like Elijah, that we were completely helpless and dependent on them to help us, because we didn't know the language, and they had to teach us the language, but we also didn't know how to live without electricity. We didn't know how to cook our meals. We didn't know how to wash our clothes. Washing our clothes in particular, they taught us how, but we never quite got the hang of how we were supposed to scrub on our wrist, And Jamelin and I both, after a few months of doing this, had these sores on our knuckles that would just kind of, from the friction of the clothes on, as we rubbed. And we couldn't, it was painful, but we didn't know how else to do it. And one morning, Jamelin was visiting a neighbor, a woman named Jezela. And she was having coffee with her, and Jezela noticed these open sores on her knuckles, that weren't bleeding, but were kind of weeping, And she said, "What are those from?" And Jamelin explained, "Well, we've been washing clothes, and I always get sores when I wash clothes." And Jezela said to her, "From now on, you bring your clothes to me. You have more important things to do in our community than I'll wash your clothes for you." And it was this amazing gift, and it was the beginning of this really beautiful friendship between my wife and Jezela. Every morning, Jamelin would go over to Jezela's, and it was like her safe space. And Jezela always had some coffee ready for her. And Jamelin would just sit and they would talk while Jezela was doing all of her morning chores and routines, getting the kids ready for school and stuff, And Jezela at that time had 4 kids living at home. And Jamelin told me the story one day she was down there. And she was watching as Jezela was getting breakfast ready. And breakfast that morning consisted of 1 hard-boiled egg that she was boiling for the kids. And Jamelin in her mind was thinking, wow, that's not much of a breakfast, to split it 4 ways. And as the kids finally were getting dressed and had their school uniforms on, were about ready to go for school, about that time some neighbor kids came over. Because that was how it was in the village where we lived, is the kids kind of moved freely from one house to another. Like we talk about takes a village to raise a child, that's the way they did it. And when, when kids were at your house, whether they were your kids or not, you were responsible for their care, and you had complete discretion to discipline them, but you also, provided for them. And so Jamelin, in her mind was like, when these 3 other kids show up, she thought, well, Jezela would just feed her own kids and not these other kids, but that's not the way the culture works. If they're at your house, then you share. And so Jamelin watched as Jezela cut the egg in 7 slices, and each kid got a slice of a hard-boiled egg. And Jamelin told me that story, and she says, I'll never look at the story of the feeding the 5,000 in the same way. That we didn't think 2 loaves and fishes, two loaves of bread and some fish were enough. She didn't think an egg was enough, and yet somehow, some way, God made it enough. A friend of mine experienced this generosity, this hospitality in Haiti. Right after the earthquake, she went down with me, and this was like maybe 2 months afterwards. A lot of people were still living in tents or shacks that they just kind of cobbled together with tarps and tin. And yet every home we went to, they would bring chairs out, they would sit us down, they'd share with us whatever they had, whether it's mangoes or breadfruit or whatever they had from their garden. It was just the generosity and hospitality of the people. And this friend of mine who experienced this for a week, after it was all over, her takeaway, she said, was that generosity has nothing to do with abundance. By comparison, we have so much, and yet we struggle to be as generous as they are. She kind of reflected on, she says, it's not about abundance, it's about your spirit, whether you're a closed system, like self-sufficient, take care of myself first, or whether you're open, willing to receive, but also willing to share. And the only change I would make to my friend's statement that generosity has nothing to do with abundance is this: that generosity has the capacity to create its own abundance. That when we share, somehow we still have enough. In fact, we have more than enough. And then we get to Act 3 of the story, which Sharon didn't read just a moment ago. We stopped before we got to Act 3. And Act 3 of the story starts off with a tragedy. The widow's son dies. And she yells, as I would imagine she would yell. She yells at Elijah and she says, "What sin have I committed? Where is your God? How could he let this happen to my son when I've shared all we had with you?" And Elijah has no response except to take the son and take him upstairs and pray over him. And he cries out to God in much the same way, "Oh God, behold this family. Why have you brought calamity upon them when they have done nothing but provide for me? You sent me here, God. Where are you now?" Now I want to remind you what this story is about. Step back to the beginning. What was it about? It's about the conflict between Baal and Yahweh. And it's the question of who has the power to provide, who has the power to give life. And this story answers the question, because then God breathes back into the widow's son, causes his breath to re-enter him, and he is alive again. And Elijah takes him down to the widow and restores her son to him. And she cries out and she says, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." I mean, she's been a Baal worshiper her whole life. And she says, "Now I get it. Your God is the real God. Yahweh is truth." You see, we think this story is about the widow, perhaps, about her faithfulness and generosity. We would think it might be about Elijah, perhaps, about his, power to stop up the rain and so forth. It's about none of those things. This story is about God. And it's about God's ability to give life. God's provision in the meanest of circumstances for people who are desperate. That God provides in the least expected ways. That God provides both for Elijah and for the widow before they even know what needs they have. God puts Elijah in the widow's path, not just for his salvation, but for her salvation too. You see, when she shares her meager, resources, the widow somehow gets to participate in her own salvation. Just think about that for a moment. I said this way back when we did the series on Abraham. The Hebrew root of the word provide means to see. And our word provide, if you take it back to its etymological roots, has the same meaning, pro-video, the God who sees before. God sees our needs even before we know them ourselves. And God takes steps to meet those needs even before we're aware. That's what the life of faith is about. Last week, Seth told a story, and I love the story. If you missed Seth's sermon last week, it's a great story about a moment in time where his faith was tested with chastity, and they had to decide whether or not to give this money that had been pledged to a church that he had set aside for that purpose. And even as he was wrestling with that act and sent that money, already help was on its way in the form of an aunt who was sending a check to him. You know, help was already, and as you told that story, Seth, it made me think about my own experience when Jamel and I were raising money to go to Haiti. And that support came from so many people and churches. And what really humbled me wasn't the big gifts from the big churches. It was the small gifts from people that really humbled me. There's a couple that I grew up mowing their yard down the street. And they were an older couple on a fixed income. And when they pledged to support me going to Haiti, holy cow, it humbled me. One of my high school buddies who I knew was living in a time like he and his wife had nothing. They had their first child. They were living without any real margin at all. And yet he pledged every month to send Jamel and I money so that we could serve in Haiti. Those were the gifts that truly humbled me. And I just found it to be, that was one of those profound experiences of this universal truth that often when we think we're putting ourselves in a position to give, we receive far more. Have you ever had that experience? Of a time where you thought, I'm going to give in this way, and you didn't even know how God was going to use that gift, God was going to use that moment in order to minister to a need of your soul that you weren't even aware that you had until that moment. Generosity creates its own abundance. And when we place our lives and our gifts in our Master's hands, He uses those gifts, He uses those acts of faith to continue working out His salvation in our lives. That's the beauty, the mystery of God's will. So next week is our Commitment Sunday. It's a Sunday where we celebrate all the ways God has provided for us in the past year, but also when I ask for everyone's commitment for the year ahead. If you haven't received a letter in the mail this week, you'll probably receive it tomorrow or Tuesday. And in that letter, you'll see a letter from me and a copy of our budget and a pledge card for the year ahead. You can also find the pledge card online. But I know sending it out, like in my head, I was like, man, this is rough timing. Because we are living in a time of scarcity, right? I mean, so many people have experienced a loss of income or whatever plans they had have been demolished. You know, we're living in this time of great anxiety, of not knowing what the future holds. And I get it. It might be difficult to think about a pledge right now for the year ahead. But I just invite you this week as you prepare, as you think and pray over the pledge, I invite you to think instead about the ways in which God has provided and is providing even now for you. As Sherman testified, our God is a provider. And the question is not what we have in our jar. The question is, how much are we willing to place in God's hands, in trust and in faith that He will always provide for our needs, because this is the testimony of Elijah. God will provide in ways that we could never see or understand, even when our brook is drying up, even when our jar is almost empty. If we trust in God, He will provide abundantly above anything we could ever think to ask, anything we could ever need, anything we could ever offer Him back. Amen.
On a Saturday in June of 2018, I was headed out for a bicycle ride. I'd been riding for about 20 to 30 years. And after less than a mile, I had to turn back because of chest discomfort. The following Monday, I had the same problems when trying to cut the grass, and I went in to see the doctor, who scheduled me for a treadmill test on Thursday. Thursday afternoon, a couple minutes into the treadmill test, the supervisor stopped the test and left the room without saying anything. Shortly after that, a cardiologist met with Sue and I and said, "Mr. Forey, I'm reviewing your treadmill results. They're the most abnormal I've ever seen. Your wife is to take you immediately to the heart hospital and not go home." The next afternoon, I had my arteries videoed and mapped. The cardiologist at the hospital reviewed those results with us and said, "Mr. Forey, you have 6 major blockages. We're sorry, the stents will be of no help. We're going to put you on the list for a bypass at the first availability." 4 nights later, I was being updated on the status of my upcoming surgery by the nurse when a woman appeared behind the nurse in a gown, very eerily. The nurse didn't even acknowledge she was there. After the nurse gave me my update for the day, she left the room, and that's when the woman spoke. She said, "My name is Debbie. I'm here and I have a message for you. He said you would be all right." I looked at her. The way she said it, I knew that this was a special moment. So I looked back at her and pointed to the ceiling and said, "You mean he?" And she said, "Yes. He, God, spoke to me and told me to give you the message that you would be okay." After this, we visited briefly. I wished her well because she was there awaiting a heart transplant because her heart was in very bad shape. That was the last time I ever saw Debbie. 3 days later, I finally had, after 2 cancellations, a successful heart surgery by Dr. Zanotti, an excellent surgeon and a wonderful person. And after several complications over the next 2 weeks, I would go home. But the important thing was that all through this, I never had any concern about the outcome. I had been assured by Debbie that I would be all right. The day I'd been entered into the hospital, my wife and I were to be in Nashville, Tennessee, taking our oldest granddaughter on a 3-day celebration trip for her 13th birthday. Had I not been in the heart hospital for that procedure and that surgery and been in Nashville, the end of the story could have been totally different. I'm convinced that God's timing is perfect and that He has a plan for us. My name is Jim Forey, and this is my story.